I don't know how many of you have read The Life of Pi. It's a book. It's sort of like a modern fable in a way. It became very popular at one point, and it basically tells the story in a simplistic way. It tells the story of a Indian boy, a boy who grows up in India. His parents run a zoo, and they decide to move lock, stock, and barrel across the ocean. They're in a ship transporting all the zoo animals. The ship sinks. Long story short, the ship sinks. He's the sole survivor on the lifeboat. And except for Richard also survives, and he finds Richard swimming in the ocean and says, "Get on board, Richard, come and join me." Only trouble is Richard does get on the boat, and then it turns out Richard is a tiger. And Pi finds himself in a life raft with a tiger, and the story is about him, kind of his survival journey and what transpires. And as I said, it is a fable. It's lovely. So that's the backdrop to The Life of Pi, which I will now share with you. And I apologize. I have a puppy in the background who insisted on coming with, and is now locked in the house and is desperately unhappy. So I can't help that. So it's not letting me just share my presentation, so I'll have to do that. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it now.
All right, so the first thing I want to say is that I had great fun and games playing with AI. Image creators came up with this lovely image. I decided to do a play on the life of Pi because we talk about the data lifecycle or the information lifecycle, and PI, of course, is personal information. So I felt like it was too good an opportunity to miss the opportunity to have the life of Pi as a subject. And I got onto an AI generator, and in Canva, actually, very nice, and said, give me a data manager protecting personal information from a tiger in the same format as the cover of the book Life of Pi. And I came up with a series of images, and it was great fun. Highly recommend it. Good way to spend a Saturday. All right. So just a little bit about me, if you don't know about me yet. My name is Caroline Mouton. I've been in many IT-related roles over the years. I now call myself the IT Whisperer. Did a BA in communications for that reason. And
sorry, Caroline, I think we're seeing your team screen and not the actual presentation. Okay, now we got the image of your presentation.
Have you got about me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I'm going to go back. I want you to see the picture. So this,
yes.
I explained the whole picture. There it is. I think it's lovely. So the life of Pi. So we're going to do a series of talks. And oh, sorry, I must just give a caveat. I'm not a lawyer. I have no law degree. I'm not giving legal advice in any shape or form. It is your responsibility to figure out what your legal requirements are, especially around POPI. But what I can do is help you to interpret POPI into natural language and to help you to understand the best practices that will help you with your compliance. All right, so why the life of Pi? As I said, I did spend a Saturday on the images, so you'll get a few of them today. Basically, it's the life cycle approach to data protection, or how to tame that tiger in your boat, right? Like I think we sometimes approach privacy with a little bit of tender hooks and worried that it's going to bite us in the bum. And there's far too much of it sometimes for our little boats. And the approach we're going to take over the next few months is we're going to talk through the data lifecycle, but I'm starting at the back. I'm starting at disposal of data. And the reason is because if you start with the end in mind, there's a far better chance that you'll design things in a way that are going to help you and support you with your compliance obligations. There's no point getting to the end of the end of the data lifecycle. You're ready to dispose of the data and you have no idea what to do with it. So we're going to talk about that today. Right, so data disposal, and off we go. The topics in general about when it comes to data disposal is, first of all, what needs to be disposed of. So how do we know what data we need to dispose of? Why must we do it? We'll touch on that very briefly. then when must it be done? I think that's the biggest question people always ask. The how must it be done? I'm going to kind of fob you off. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm going to give you a bit of a way of thinking about it, because that's a whole discussion on its own. And then what evidence needs to be generated? And I'll give you the short answer now. You do need evidence that you've deleted data. You have to be able to say that the data was deleted for a reason. Right, so let's get down to that. What are the reasons? So what needs to be disposed of? Am I coming across okay? Is everybody seeing my screen share? Are we all good?
Yes, we are. We
All
are.
right,
All good.
so interrupt me if there's any questions. Okay.
Shall do.
All right, so first of all, data disposal, what is it going to apply to? What do we need to delete? Essentially everything. Any data that you create, when it gets to the end of life, it needs to be deleted. So it's helpful to break it out into what types of data we're talking about. And in my world, when I talk about information governance, I like to slice it in the way to okay, look, there's structured information as a way of dealing with that. We have unstructured information like documents, and if you've ever dealt with a Windows file share server, you'll appreciate the pain of managing documents. And even in SharePoint, you can end up with piles of spaghetti. So, and now we've got more, right? Now we've got chats, we've got WhatsApps, we've got comments on documents, we've got Teams, we've got hi. And then, of course, we mustn't forget we also have non-digital information. And sometimes people forget that there might be more, depending on the industry you're in, there might be more of that than you think. So I put litmus test in there because at one stage I worked at Mediclinic, and one of the records that they keep is before the patient goes through an operation, the theatre is put through a series of tests. And one of the tests involves litmus test paper. So if you don't know what a litmus test is, it's like a piece of paper that has chemicals on it, and then they swab it against surfaces and then test to see if there's contaminants. So they need to check, and there's like printouts out of equipment to make sure the equipment was calibrated correctly. So all of this has to happen before surgery. And all of that goes into the patient record. So the record of that event, of that surgery, includes all of those litmus tests and pieces of paper. And you might be in an industry that has similar sort of not normal records. So it's important to remember it does include everything. Obviously, when it comes to personal information, that example wouldn't be great for personal information, but it is part of the patient record. Right, one of Howard's slides. So metadata for unstructured data. So just on that topic of unstructured data, you do need to make sure that you are creating structure where there isn't any, right? So the way obviously you do that is metadata. And the record keeping metadata is where the retention policies come in. So people often ask me, what is a record? It's essentially a snapshot or like an evidence of activity. So it would be a report or an audit trail or a log, logs that are generated, or yeah, it could be a photograph. A PDF document very often is a type of record because it can't be changed. So it's normally records keeping means keeping stuff that isn't going to change or shouldn't be changed. But unstructured data obviously includes things like your policy documents, your process documents, and we'll talk about a good example just now where there was a recent LinkedIn article about call centers and the recording people's voices from a call center point of view. And we'll talk about that. Is there anything you want to jump in and talk about on the slide, Howard?
No, I'm okay with that.
Okay, that preservation metadata is important. That comes up. There's certainly around archives. So the end of life of data or a document or something or a record. It might not be to destroy it immediately. You might actually need to keep it. So it might need to be archived. And archive means it can't be changed. It's maybe not as easy to access. It's a little bit more off-site, but it is available if it's needed for particular reasons. And one of the reasons you might need it is because of legal litigation. So we talk about e-discovery and legal hold as well as part of that preservation. So this was that LinkedIn article I mentioned about call centers. So I've got a couple of just a couple of quotes that I've extracted out of it. I thought it was a nice example. We've all called call centers, and the transcripts. I mean, the recording is one thing, but the point is, there's recordings, there's transcripts, and the things that you're discussing on the call might actually be really personal, and might be sensitive personal information. So if you remember, SPI and POPI is things like health information, your maybe objectionable behavior or criminal behavior. It includes your political views. It's a whole bunch of stuff. So if it's sensitive information, you might well be talking or giving information to people. Maybe they're asking you for your bank account. Very often their identity, you want to identify who you are. They ask you for everything that a hacker would need to impersonate you. So it's information that can be quite sensitive. And what one of the points that this article was pointing out, it was written by Sharon Bauer. One of the things she pointed out there is that retention periods, if you have a call center, so very often it's outsourced, and so it's a nice example of something where it's not immediately under the control of the organization or the responsible party, as I would call them. So your organization or your company might have outsourced a call center. Everything we're talking about today should apply to both your company and the call center, because they're handling the data of your data subjects. You're the responsible party, so therefore you're responsible for that data. And retention periods must be set to, there's got to come a point in time where you have to just permanently destroy data. So it might be a long time in the future, but there has to come a point. And if you're outsourcing your call center, their data should be transferred back to the company if that contract is ended. So as soon as the relationship with the call center is ended, it's no longer an outsourced provider, the data should leave the call center and should come to the company that the outsourcing. And from their point of view, it's permanently destroyed as soon as the contract's ended. From your point of view, it gets destroyed based on some of the criteria we'll talk about in a minute. And one of the pointers she made in there is that people ask, well, what if we get a complaint and we need to refer back to the call? We need the evidence of what was said and during that call. And that's a valid point. We don't want to prematurely destroy data, but we can't keep it forever, and I'll show you why in a minute. But essentially, you need a retention policy, right? So your retention policy should cater for exceptions. So this is very based on your business. If you have exceptions where you think you're going to have future complaints, or you think you're going to have lawsuits, and maybe you're looking back on the history of your of your customer relationships, and it's not unusual for somebody to come back 2 years after the fact to lay a complaint, then it's not unreasonable for you to keep those recordings for 2 years, right? Because you've got evidence that actually this is kind of in our interest to do this. So just to bear that in mind as a practical example, and we'll pull back to it again throughout the talk just to come back to these points. But something that you can do is, maybe you don't need all the data, right? So you can redact sensitive personal information, make it less sensitive, make it data that isn't going to cause immense harm should it be fall into the wrong hands. So any thoughts or questions on that? Anybody got any examples of that or experiences of this kind of thing, this type of problem? We need to get rid of the data, but we don't want to.
The only one that I have is around that tax. I think I shared on the weekend. I spoke to on the tax side.
Yeah, maybe talk through that. That was a good example.
Yeah, so I always try to give people, and especially business people, an incentive to destroy and archive and dispose, because typically they don't want to get rid of anything. And the one experience that we had was with the tax evidence on the accounting side. So the way it works is that if the taxman can come to us at any point in time and ask for evidence of a certain claim that we performed, and I think that's a 5-year period. I can't remember the exact details. Now, after 5 years, you don't need to submit that evidence if you can prove that you've destroyed it. If you cannot prove that you've destroyed it, you need to submit it. So there's lots of, it sounds bad, but it's a case of, it's in your interest in a way to then get rid of these slips or whatever it is, your shoebox of things, to get rid of them and ensure that you're not hanging on to anything like that. So this disposal becomes quite a handy situation. And I've also been exposed with big companies as well, as they asked to produce evidence of a certain conditions on which companies were merged and things like that. And it was 30 years ago, and because they didn't have any evidence, they had to spend time finding it. Now, unfortunately for them, they had restructured the entire SharePoint, and finding this was I think it was a 4-week journey of trying to get hold of that information. Lots of embarrassment, lots of people looking at them saying you're really disorganized. But yeah, just be careful of this situation.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has come up against, hit their head up against consequences to A, not having your data organized and ready to find it, or B, having too much information and struggling. Because I know one of the problems that I've seen, like one of the returns on, if you're looking for return on investment to motivate for retention, setting a retention policy, is just if you are going through some sort of litigation, you don't want to throw an entire SharePoint or file share at a bunch of lawyers and pay lawyer fees by the hour to sort through the data. That can happen and does happen, and is one of the reasons why sometimes the court cases cost a lot. So moving on. Righty, so essentially what we're saying is get some structure and have controls, right? Couple of just pointers around structures and controls. I think data ownership is probably one of the biggest things. You know, Poppy talks a lot about accountability, and FYI, with Poppy in effect, the head of the organization or the information officer is accountable for retention. So it's not something that you can afford to just ignore like you could 30 years ago. You now have to have a retention policy. You've got to look after it, at least for personal information. But in my opinion, there's no point looking after just personal information, as we all know. It's like rather just manage your data and manage your personal information as well. So data ownership, I think, helps enormously. So it's that delegation from the information officer down to data to take ownership for the life cycle of personal information. All the categorization, classification, best practices, all the metadata, labeling, information security practices that are out there. All of that helps to structure information. Now, the important thing is that those, if you're going to apply any kind of metadata schema or any kind of categorization across, to your data, it's got to be across all of the information. It's got to be the enterprise information. So it's got to be applied consistently, regardless of where the data is or what format it's in or how old it is. It's very important that when you look for a particular classification or categorization of data, you get all of it, right? You're not going to have some stuff that just didn't get labeled or some stuff that just has a completely different categorization. And one of the pitfalls here is that information security very often will apply classification from an information security point of view. And now Poppy wants you to apply categorization from a personal information point of view. Somebody's got to normalize this into a single schema that is applied consistently. The other thing, kind of a concept that I've come across over the years, is to have golden records. Like, know what version of where's the version of truth? Where can you find the truth? Like, where can you find the right records? And manage those very well. And sort of try to stay away from rot, right? Which is the last point, the redundant, obsolete, and trivial stuff. So, don't have more than one copy just in case, or have data that's so obsolete, you still got version 1 of a document and you're busy with version 27. There really is no point to version 1 unless there's some legal implication. And transition buckets is kind of this picture I got in my head when I was discussing this with Howard, was that, so I've seen it with file shares. a simple way to disposal is handle the buckets of data. So as data, if you're talking about like structured data in databases, we tend to go like quite granular down to sort of record level, and we might want to go right down to file level. But sometimes it's easier to just say, well, if we have the HR department has a folder and it's got, and I kid you not, I've seen this, it's got over 100,000 documents in it. It's easier to just say, well, there's nothing in HR legislation that says you have to keep something for longer than 10 years. So anything older than 10 years, we just dump it. We just get rid of it. There's also the idea that if you if you've got the ETL process, you've got data moving out of databases, maybe into the data lake, and then data getting moved around, or sort of transformed somehow and then put into a data warehouse or into master data. All of that transitional data, there's no point dealing with that as an independent record. It's like that's there for a purpose. So deal with it, get rid of it when the purpose is over. And that is something that Poppy endorses. I'll show you. So the idea is that if you've got data in transit or data that's going through a series of transformations, or it's test data for version 1 of the software, now you're on version 10, just dump the data in that bucket, right? So just as simple as almost like batch processing for destruction. I don't know, Howard, if you want to interrupt or jump in there, if I skewed what you were saying.
Yeah, so I've got two questions for you. The one is that categorization scheme. What I've been doing is using a multifaceted taxonomy, which doesn't require me to force everything into a hierarchical structure, but can have multiple compulsory tags for classification. I just wanted to check if you were comfortable with that, because you seem to say that it needed one structure, one.
No, it's not one structure. It's one strategy.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So it's basically
okay.
when you design these things, think enterprise wide. I think what happens is that these things happen in silos. You'll have HR will create theirs and marketing will have theirs, and there is very little cross pollination, except maybe for security, who now wants to say whether something is wants to give us security classification.
Right.
And suddenly it's an alien idea, but it doesn't really fit in. So
Okay.
it's more just think about it at an enterprise level, whatever way you do it,
Right.
just so that in design you are thinking about the litmus tests while you're busy thinking about the master data. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, is the puppy irritating?
And then just to talk a little bit about the transition buckets, what we did was in the warehousing, because we see the warehouse as a way of archiving our transactional records, we would go through a bucket, sort of time buckets of the warehouse data. And so we would, for example, we'd be looking at operational data, which had very little history. Maybe you're talking within a month, maybe a week, and then you'd have the month-end bucket of transactional data, and then you'd have the strategic data that's longer, but the strategic data can be grouped, or we can actually remove some of the PI when it gets to a certain level of information, sort of past 5 years or whatever it is, and there's almost the standard way of ensuring that your data is becoming archived and then at a stage becoming disposed in your warehouse. So when we look at that in terms of the type of decisions that's going to be required, that's the approach that we take, and we build those buckets from that movement point of view.
Yeah, and I think the key is to be thinking about what are we going to do at the end of life? When is end of life? What are we going to do when we get there? And how do we know that we're there, right? So just to think about that at the design stage. Cool. I just wanted one more thing. I just want to talk about a separation of duties. It's really hard to decide to delete data that you've been working on. It's really much easier if you have someone like a records manager. In the olden days, there was a records manager, and that person was responsible for making sure paper flowed through the organization and the paper got collected and that paper got disposed of. And having somebody like a records manager is a really good idea. Just from it's almost like having a change manager, right? It's somebody who's not got investment in it. You could take a cold hard look at it and say, no, actually, really, this is policy. Let's get rid of it. It just really helps. So Howard, just to jump into what you're saying here, there are a lot of practices that support retention, and this is why I wanted to start with retention. Sorry, with disposal of data, is because there's a lot of things that need to happen in the data lifecycle or in the way that you manage data that will support the way that you dispose data. So we've been talking a lot about schemas and so a couple of other things. Of course, we need to have digital asset management. So, for example, document management, thinking about your videos, your CCTV footage. Marketing often have very large images, billboards, things like that need to be managed. So it's good to think about your digital asset management, and also to have a solid inventory of the things that you care about and that you need to manage. It's easy, and I think even if you're a small business, I think it's important to get that right.
Yeah, and also what they do in that e-discovery process is something called a litigation response data map, where you would provide it to the lawyers or the people doing the e-discovery on your data. They would be able to see where the data is kept, and it's typically for a period, so maybe 90 days, where you give them the map, and then you're saying that they can access that information for that period.
Yeah, so it's a nice controlled way, and it's kind of thought through about how to manage it. And I think if you're going through a litigation process, if you've never heard about e-discovery before, it can be quite difficult to manage. But if you understand that there's a best practice attached to it, I think it helps to know that you can do it in a controlled way. So this, I'm not going to go through this, but just to give you an idea of some of the tools and technical backup that you need just to make this work. It's not separate, like getting rid of data is not separate from the way you manage data. It's kind of all got to be built in. So yeah, if you think about your website, all the data that we generate, it's quite something. And with personal information, with Poppy, what they're asking you to do is to kind of join the dots of what personal information is kind of, there's kind of personal information dotted around in all of these, in all of your different systems. And you need the right tools, you need practices, and you need techniques for managing all of that. So let's get on to the meaty bit about when we must dispose of data, right? Again, thanks to Canva for providing a picture. That's sweet. So, alrighty, so let's jump into what Poppy actually says. So the section of Poppy that's relevant to this is section 14. And I'm going to break through the sections for you, just to show you how it works into what we've been talking about. I might have to let the puppy out, but we'll see how we go. Yeah. Okay. When is the end of life? Poppy says it's when your purpose is done. So like you collect, and in Poppy, you have to collect data for a purpose, right? So just to back, so it's, you collect it for a purpose. You might repurpose it, which is called further processing. So it's like we collected it for one reason, but now we realize it's useful and we can use it for another reason. And that's perfectly fine. You just have to go through the lawful processing steps to work with it that way. So just to reiterate, what do we mean by purpose, right? So first of all, the purpose is attached to the responsible party. The responsible party is this blue company in the middle. And they're the responsible party because they decide how to process the personal information. So as soon as you decide on what data must be collected, why it must be collected, what you want to do with it, you're the responsible party of that personal information. And you are responsible to your data subjects, which are the greenies on the left-hand side. So the information officer is ultimately accountable. So disposal of data is Section 14 is the responsibility of the information officer and ultimately the head of the organization, if that's been delegated. And then just in terms of purpose, the question is, what was our stated reason for collecting this personal information in the first place? When we collect data from a data subject, we've got to tell them why we're doing it. What's our purpose? Have we documented our processing operations, right? Do we know what processes are relevant or going to be used to process this data? And if you're going to start changing that purpose, you might be moving into further processing, and you might need to go back to the beginning and talk to the data subject again and explain what you're going to do, what else you want to do with this data. So just to give you a little bit of a recap on purpose when it comes to Poppy. So that word purpose is very specific in Poppy. And when we talk about purpose, one of the things that Poppy will say to you is you need to have a reason for having it, right? One of the ways of thinking about that is the curve of the value of information over time. So initially, the data is super important to you. You get to a point where you kind of used it. It's kind of useful, but then it wanes in importance and it sort of gets buried, right? The idea is you should have a retention limit. Like, how long do we actually want to hold on to this? Now, in the olden days, it was storage, right? Because paper cost money to store. Nowadays, it really doesn't matter how much. I mean, the cost of storage really isn't really a problem anymore. Maybe backups is a bit more of a problem, but not for everyone. And there has to come a point where you make a decision. Are we going to archive it or are we going to delete it? And then you might have some kind of a legal issue or something where you've got to go back and it becomes important again for a moment in time. But ultimately, the value gets lost over time. So when you're thinking about, oh, we need reasons, like we're keeping this data for just in case, just be honest about where is it in the life cycle and is it actually adding that much value to your organization that it's worth taking on this kind of purpose limitation, the risk of lawful processing. Please let me know if the dogs are a pain. Okay, so why does Poppy say you can keep data, right? So first of all, personal information must not be retained any longer than necessary for achieving the purpose. So Poppy's very clear. Once you're done with your purpose, the data goes. That's it. Unless one of the reasons you keep it is because you might reasonably require the record for lawful purposes. So that are related to your functions and activities. When it says lawful, it's talking about the lawful processing in Poppy. So you might have reason to keep it that it's justifiable. It sort of says, listen, we've got functions, activities, things that we're doing in our organization where we kind of need to hold on to the data. It's not purely, we're no longer keeping it purely for the reason that we collected it, but we kind of need it. So maybe training. So like in a data center, you might have collected the voice recording initially to have a record of what was agreed, but it's also there for training your staff. So therefore you might want to hold on to certain recordings because it's a good example for training material. Okay, so it's a slight difference for the function of purpose. But what does this mean? How do we structure this? Remember, we need a structured approach. We can't just have this loosey-goosey thing like, oh, well, that's fine. We don't have to delete it because we're going to need it anyway. No, you've got to have a structured approach. And the one way we do it is we have a retention policy. We keep a retention schedule. And you make sure you've got the right metadata to help you with presentation up front in the design phase. So a retention schedule is, the policy is company-wide. The schedule, the schedule is usually per function. In a bigger company, it'll be per function. So like HR will have its own schedule. Marketing will have its own schedule. Sorry, guys. Is the puppy crazy? I think I'm just going to go open the door.
Okay. So
I just wanted to leave you with that. The policy is company-wide. A schedule can be down to specifics because your HR manager will understand the legal requirements. Oh, gosh, it's going mad here. Okay, dogs have to leave. Howard, could you talk about the retention policies for one minute?
Yeah, sure. Fine. So, yeah, the retention policy, that's, yes, Niels. Question?
How's it, Howard? Yeah, I just want to
Niels.
get clarity. I mean, in our world, that she says there's specific purpose related to its functional activities, but we've got a lot of other legislation, the FACE and the FICA and
Yeah.
treat your TCF and all those things, that has an impact on our retention policy and
Yes.
those retention periods. Is that also what she's referring to here?
Yes, that thing where it says the unless the party responsibly requires the record for lawful purposes related to its functions or activities. So any legal commitment that you have or compliance, regulatory compliance that you have, Niels, would fall under that B. And this is when you set up your retention policy and retention schedule, you're going to describe all of the different things that contribute to the schedule of archiving and disposing.
Perfect. Yeah, I think we do actually have a retention policy, and we have highlighted those. And that is
right.
That was driven that limit, that period after. In our world, the policy has expired. We retain it for a certain period, a number of years, and that's enforced by other legislation that we have to follow.
So yeah, so just to jump in, that's what the schedule is there for, is to simplify the other legislation. So HR will know how long certain records must be kept for HR purposes. Their retention schedule will detail, these are the records we must keep, this is how long we must keep it, and this is the legislation that tells us we must do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So schedules are actually really important, and they are one of the nice ways to control your world and make sure that you're doing the right things at the right time. I just want to point out that these, when Poppy says there are exceptions to deleting the data. So Poppy says you've got to keep it for as long as the purpose is necessary. But then it says you're allowed to keep it if there's a legal reason, okay? Like we just spoke about in the schedule. So if there's a legal reason, you can keep the data because of that, which might go well past the purposes for which you originally collected it. It also says you can keep it if you have stipulated that in a contract with the data subject. It also says you can keep it if you need it for your business purposes, like we saw just now, where I was talking about how you can keep the data if you've got some kind of business processing that needs it, like the training on the data center. The other reason you could maybe keep it is if the data subject agreed. So consent, as always, I remember I always stress this with everybody, consent is very expensive to manage. So if you're going to keep something for 5 years and base it on consent, you better be ready for it, because it's not an easy thing to manage. So don't rely on consent if you don't have to. Legitimate interests is also kind of touch and go. You've got to prove that you did your homework, right? It's not a get out of jail free card. So what does Poppy say? Section 14. It says you're not allowed to retain the data for longer than the purpose, unless retention is required or authorized by law. The responsible party reasonably requires the records, so legitimate interest of the responsible party. The retention of a record is required by contract. Or the data subject, or if it's a child, a competent person, has consented to the retention of the record. And like I said, consent can be a bit of a problem. We'll talk about that in a minute. So then there's a follow-on to section 14, which says you can keep it longer if you need the data for historical reasons, statistical reasons, or research purposes. Okay, but again, you must have safeguards in place to make sure that the records cannot be used for other purposes. So in other words, if you're going to outsource the data management or the data archiving or something to someone else, there has to be a contract in place, for example, to make sure, as a safeguard, to make sure that they're clear that this data is locked down. It's there for statistical referencing. It is not there for any other reason. Okay, and obviously, if you can redact the data, if you can make it not personal information anymore, even better, because then Poppy doesn't really apply. The one thing that Poppy says, which I think is quite key, especially in this age of AI, is that if you have used that data to make a decision about the data subject, this isn't automated decision making, this is any decision making. you have got to retain the record, in other words, the snapshot of the data that you based that decision on, for as long as may be required by law or a code of conduct. We've spoken about codes of conduct before. If you belong, for example, to the advertising agency or advertising bureau of South Africa, they have a code of conduct, right? Or the Direct Marketing Association, they have a code of conduct. So if there's a law or a code of conduct that says you need to retain the period, retain the record, then again it's legal reason, that's fine. You could also keep it for a period which will give that person enough time or reasonable opportunity to request access to the record. So if I have been impacted by a decision, let's say for example I've been turned down for a loan, and I just accept that fact and I move on. But about 5 years later, I want to buy a house, and they look at the previous decision to not ordinary home loan, and they decide that they somehow that influences the decision. I might want to go back to the original bank and ask them for the reasoning behind turning down my home loan. Maybe I didn't think about it at the time, and now I want it. This again comes down to legitimate interest, but now it's the legitimate interest of the data subject themselves. So if you think it's reasonable for someone to come back to you 10 years after the fact to ask you, why did you make that decision about me? Then have that in your retention policy, describe that in your retention schedule, and set your destruction date accordingly, but have it in archive, right? Because it shouldn't be accessible. It shouldn't be something that gets changed. It's a record. Does that make sense? Am I making sense on that? Okay, so the whole thing about decisions. So let's go back to the call center example. If your call center has a decision tree that they work through, so in other words, the call center agents are given a cheat sheet, like a set of things that they need to, questions they need to ask, and there's sort of outcomes based on answers. And that decision tree kind of leads to some kind of a vetting process, or creates a decision about the data subject. Then those decision trees, if they change, you need to keep the record of what the decision tree was at a point in time. So you need a record of the decision trees at points in time. So every time you change those decision trees, you need to keep a record of what it was. So your change control needs to be in place, your version control needs to be in place, and you need to understand that those decision trees are records. Okay. Where we've got AI tools doing things like assisting with customer identification, I literally don't know what it is you're going to have to store. I've never had to work with an AI tool assisting with customer identification. I don't know if anybody on the call has. AI tools assessing customer sentiment is something that's happening in call centers that was discussed in that article. So customer sentiment is when the AI listens to your voice, your tone of voice, and decides, oh, you're actually upset, or you are irritated, or you actually meant something different to what you were saying. So this kind of a sentiment is overlaid. And yeah, by the way, that decision might not be about the person calling. I've actually heard an example. I worked with a call center crowd once, software supplier, who their AI tool, machine learning tool, was being used as a way to automatically assess the call center agents. So if the software said, oh, by the end of this call, the customer was happier, then the call center agent would automatically get a performance, get a good performance rating. But if the sentiment indicated that the customer was unhappy or frustrated, then the call center agent would go up for review. And that's the kind of thing. Now, in that situation, the data subject is the call center agent. And you need to have a record of why the software decided that customer was not happy. Does that kind of make sense?
So could I just ask a question there? So maybe the wording's funny, but it's not so much the AI tools, but the outcome of the model, right? So, for example, it would be the AI outcome of the customer identification, or the AI outcome of the customer sentiment assessment. It's not, oh, I use this tool, this model, I use this chat GPT. It's not at that level. It's the outcomes of what the AI model has suggested.
And that's why we're having this conversation, because I don't know. Like I said, I haven't been involved in an AI tool that has assisted with customer identification. I don't know how it works. I don't know if how well the models are.
Yeah.
What exactly would the record be? I suppose that's the discussion point. Like, what would the records be?
Yeah.
That would keep a record for decision making. That if the data subject needed to come back and ask you why you made that decision, that you would be able to. So, the call center agent's point of view, they might want to question why they were put up for review.
Right.
And maybe the models improve over time. So something that wouldn't have caused a flag earlier is now causing a flag. And the call center agent might say, but why is my performance degrading? My performance approval, my rating is degrading. Why is that? So I don't know what records an AI tool would provide you.
Yeah, I think that GDPR has that thing right for explanation, where they basically they have to be able to explain the conditions that the AI tool used to achieve that outcome.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like a fuzzy logic search where you say, you know, the probability of matching is 80% or whatever it is, and these were the factors that gave us that level. So that would be as part of that data that needs to be stored.
Yeah, so I think that's, and I suppose the overall point is that you need to be aware of what is the best practice. How do we do that?
Right.
How do we satisfy that requirement in Poppy?
Yeah.
And what is the record? What is considered to be the record for that particular decision?
Right. And I think Marvin has put some comments in there to say Salesforce has an AI tool that would guide an agent to get a desired outcome. Now that outcome we're talking about, that would almost be like a business outcome, either upselling or reducing the complaint or removing whatever it is. There's that outcome, but then there's also outcomes that the model has in all these different identification, sentiment analysis, and things like that. Marvin, is there any, is that you referring to the business outcome of the call or the complaint?
Hi, Howard. Hi. Yes.
Hi, Marvin.
Yeah, that's exactly that. Yes. So essentially we use Einstein to actually model we actually use Einstein to actually model the outcome of that call. So if we're trying to reduce the number of complaints, or there's a certain complaint that we know that is quite intense. For example, when it comes to finances. So in my industry, we deal with deposits and withdrawals. So customers maybe in another country, depending on the legislation again, is allowed to make certain deposits and certain withdrawals to a certain limit. So what happens is we actually guide the tool in such a way that the agent actually guides the customer to that type of thinking.
Right.
And then with that, we will keep the record so that when the customer calls again, we can actually revert to the customer and say, we have spoken to you already. This is the outcome of the call. So that sort of reduces those numbers as well. Yes, and particularly, like I said, on the finance side, because you're tracking it for fraud and for fraud and money laundering processes as well. Yes,
Okay.
So I'm curious then, do you have a record of why that outcome, like how it was that you came to that outcome? So the processing that happened, the decisions that happened to get to the point that made that particular recommendation.
Yeah. So essentially, so what actually happens is we have the process in place, the actual business process in place. We then test to see what we call it, the speed of answer or the efficiency of that business process. once we can see that it's taking too long, or it needs to be optimized in a certain way, that is when we actually started utilizing the AI tool, for example. What we discovered was, along with that, was we had a live chat portion also, where customers were inventing. So after the call has been done, customer vents on a live chat. We then could use that sentiment analysis to actually track that again. And that also adds to the records of the customer then. So in other words, by the end of it, we then have a complete picture of what the customer deals with, and also we also know in a nutshell how to deal with a customer as well. You know.
And
Yeah.
Marvin, just to ask you a little bit more detail there, and I think
Sure.
what's important here is the AI tool or the models receiving certain, it looks at variables and features that we talk about, and based on those variables, it will guide the agent to get the business outcome. So, or to get the final outcome. Now, I think what Caroline is saying, or what we are talking about there, is those features that were used to derive the outcome and their values, that's almost what is needed to be recorded so that people can question, why that feature led me to be rejected, or I was then blamed of a fraudulent transaction, and they should be able to get an explanation as to what led to the outcome. So the question that I think Caroline's asking is are all the input variables being stored so that you can explain the outcome?
Yes, those are being stored, and we do have a knowledge management within Salesforce itself in the ecosystem that is built. Yes. So those outcomes are mapped there, yes, with including flows and everything else that goes along with this. So that it's an explanation will be possible to get to an agent or to business. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is the interesting thing, is that there's so many weird little data sets, and it's sort of almost evolving logic or decision trees that are being used to come to the outcomes, that the record isn't the outcome anymore. The record is what was the logic, what was the data point that was used. Yeah. So could you even replicate that? Like, if you could you take it back in time and come to the same decision?
I think we could, yes. Again, depending on scenarios. So I think so far what we've seen within the Einstein model, we're using that one for example. It's ever evolving. So again, depending on scenario, depending on situation, those variables can be changed again. You know. So so it's I don't know. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting use case to see if the outcome will be the same as,
right.
You know, if you should go back in time.
And just out of interest, have you, with the use of SharePoint, but the use of Salesforce, have you considered like the POPI requirement to how your retention policy around those particular ring fencing those data sets, those data points, and those those logic trees? Have you ring fenced them as records that need to be retained for a period of time so that it can be queried by the data subject?
Yes, we actually and it's really interesting because we deal with many African countries. We have to align to each country's data integrity standards. So yes, so with the result, we've actually blanketed the period of holding that data. Yes, you know. So yeah.
Do you see how POPI is quite? It uses this kind of idea of like it's a reason. You need to afford the data subject a reasonable opportunity. It's not prescriptive. It's not going to tell you that you know when you must delete the data. It's going to tell you must be reasonable about it.
Yeah. Good case.
Yeah, and that really is just having a you know, being able to stand on your decision, like to be able to like explain why you came to that conclusion that this is what is reasonable.
Yeah.
It is a legal concept, as people will know. Lots of lawyers on the call, I'm sure. Okay, but guys, look, it's 5 o'clock. I don't know how we always run out of time on this talk. And yeah, so I'm going to leave it there because I think that's an interesting point to close it out on. And I think what I wanted to just maybe just close out with is this: when must we delete data, right? So if we go back to each of these points, the original subsequent purpose, it'll be when, for example, the request fulfillment is completed. I asked you to send me a download of a document, kept my data long enough to send that to me, now it should be gone. You had a project that collected a whole bunch of personal information. That project is finished. Maybe the end date is when, so in your retention schedule, the end date of the project would be the point where the project records need to come up for either archiving or disposal. If you have an event, for example, maybe you ask me what my dietary preferences are. As soon as that event is done or the catering is done, you don't need that data anymore. And that's what a retention schedule is there for, is to say, okay, dietary preferences for an event must only be retained for as long, up to the time that the event finishes. Or you might decide, no, people might come back with food allergies like 2 days later. So actually we only delete their requests for their food preferences 3 days later after the event. But the important thing is that somebody has it on their to-do list to go make sure that that data gets deleted, especially if you're dealing with a catering company, right? Then we had the legal obligation. So, your VAT receipts, you have to keep those for 5 years from when? From the date of purchase. And that's what the retention schedule must make clear. I know in finance, for example, you have to keep your customer records, I think it's for 5 years from the date of the last interaction with the person. So there's very specific dates, and your schedule should simplify that world for you. In medicine, I think you have to keep, if I remember correctly, I just jotted this down, but from memory, but that children's medical records have to be retained for 21 years because they need to be given be given the opportunity as an adult to request their medical records. Your operational reasons, for example, vendor contact details. I might decide I want to retain all vendor contact details for 5 years. Because that's how long it takes me to come around to deciding to review, go back to that vendor and maybe get them back again. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I say when, right? Like it's from what date and for what reason and which record does this apply to specifically. And I think some of the metadata that you might be needing to keep is these labels of, what are we talking about? We're talking about the original purpose, but now that has been overridden by a legal obligation, which has maybe been, subsequent, or maybe a contract with the data subject has overridden the original purpose. So just to be aware that these things, to support queries against decisions, that might override all of this. You might decide that actually, no, this particular record we must keep for 5 years because the person might only feel the impact of that financial decision in 5 years' time. And that's what, I just wanted to leave that with you as maybe a different facet to put on to your data, is the reasons why Poppy says you can retain data, and how they override each other. So this is the original one. Could be overridden by any one of these, but support queries against decisions could specifically override anything. It's almost like rock, paper, scissors. Yeah. So justification is always like rock, paper, scissors. And consent is the worst one. Consent is always the one that's hardest. So don't do that, because when must the data be deleted? Whenever the data subject tells you to delete it. So as soon as I withdraw my consent, you have to delete my data. And I could do that at any point. So don't rely on consent if you don't have to. That's the standard across everything in privacy management. Okay. That's it, guys.
Just a question from Niels.
Yeah, sorry, just a comment on that that consent part. However, if they just want to get clarity on that, if they request for their data to be deleted, but the purpose of that data is not yet complete, you can deny that request, right?
Yes. Yeah, so that's got to do with data subject participation. So you need to have a procedure around that, right? There needs to be very clear procedures, especially guys, especially for your call center agents. So if somebody's getting a request, like somebody's saying to somebody, you must delete my data, your call center agent needs to be empowered to know how to respond to that, because exactly, there might be very good reasons why, legal reasons, why the data cannot be deleted. So what you do is that you say, yes, we acknowledge your request, you log it, you get a ticket number, you log it every time. You have a considered response based on your policy, right? So your retention policy comes back and says, no, that type of record is under legal obligation, or is under legal hold maybe, or is, you know, we contractually are allowed to hold on to it for another year. And we don't feel that this request is justified. And then you go back with a considered response to the data subject, and that's your obligation. Your obligation is not to just jump whenever the subject says delete my data. Your obligation is to acknowledge the request, come back with a considered response that is in line with your lawful processing. However, what we're talking about here is when the only reason you have it is the consent of the data subject. And this usually applies to something like direct marketing. So any kind of marketing, direct marketing, it's always consent. And it's consent based. And as soon as the consent is removed, the data must go.
Okay, correct.
But yes, you're correct. There's a bunch of hoops. It's a request for deletion. Yeah.
And slightly different question. I assume we're open for questions now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Sorry, I won't keep you guys too long. Your talks are always very interesting. I find your talks very interesting always, so that's why.
I'm available, so I'm good. If anybody needs to drop off, please do. I get it. It's Friday, 5 o'clock on the first day of school.
And yeah, and maybe Howard, you can also give advice. We have decided as our method of destruction for majority of our structured database records to be obfuscation and not physical deletion of the data record, so that we don't lose out on transactional integrity, etc. Because we only going to be obfuscating, or will obfuscate according to a policy, personal information or sensitive information, not any transactional information that we do need to still measure the performance of our products, etc. So in other words, premium, etc. But anything related that can identify the customer to that record, we are obfuscating completely.
And I think that would fit under operational reasons. And the obfuscation is, you know, there's always like this question about, is it really de-identified? Like, are you really at a point where you can't identify the person again if you really tried? And very often the answer is no. Like you can actually re-identify data more often than not. However, even if that's the case, you've made a considered decision. You've taken a best practice approach. So you have a defensible position. You're saying, and again, not legal opinion, okay? You're saying that your operational reasons are sound because referential integrity is a big deal. And you, as long as you record that as your reason, and this is how you get to, so in other words, this is how we will dispose of this data. It's like our end of life policy for this data looks like this. And then obviously it just becomes a question of how long do you need to keep the transactions, and how long does the referential integrity of the database remain valid? Like how long do you need the database, you know, in honesty? But yeah, that's bigger questions. And the point is to be structured about it, to write it down into a retention policy and a retention schedule, and then to stick to that. And then when you do that, when you go through the process, whatever evidence you can gather of having satisfied the requirements of the retention policy, make sure you've got a record of that. You know, so whatever that looks like, whatever it means in your world.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then yeah, sorry, go Albert.
Niels, just to share with you what I've done quite often, and for different reasons. For example, I had a customer that wanted to move everything, first of all, into in memory, and then they wanted to move it into the cloud. And they were scared of the costs and things like that. So what we did was we spent a lot of time in the different buckets, and I think Caroline has this is actually quite a nice term. So let's look at the buckets. So, for example, in the original system, or what we refer to as the system of record, I would definitely get rid of those records. Given that I have an archive in the warehouse and I can do all the appropriate analytics that you've spoken about in a warehouse, but I'd want to try to keep the system of record as small and tidy as possible so that I'm not just adding more and more information and getting into trouble with the size of the databases. And I think you certainly experienced that in one of your document databases that reached many gigabytes, and there were problems backing up and things like that. So I found
Terabytes, Howard, not
yeah.
gigabytes.
I had a big argument with one customer to say the credit card transactions, how long do you really need it in your system of record? And I said, given that we can produce the evidence and do the appropriate analytics, why do you need it in your system of record? And we went through lots and lots of discussions around that, and we finally ended up in building a system that the system of record was a month old. And that's because they had to produce statements and there were some challenges. And in some cases, we actually brought the record back from the warehouse if it was needed. So we kept the original auto surrogate key and things like that. And then we moved on from the system of record, but then we had the discussion in the warehouse, and I may have mentioned there that I've sort of structured them in different types of warehouses. So your operational data warehouse, your tactical data warehouse, and your strategic. And given that strategic was used to make decisions for strategy and product performance and things that you were mentioning, I didn't need to keep the PI information at that level. It wasn't required because that strategy would be on other features that were part of our decision process that the PI wasn't required. So then we would aggregate away from that level, and that aggregation or that level of just sticking to the features meant that I could drop the actual customer record, if that makes sense. So it's that sort of discussion that you can go through. Obfuscating it is an approach. And you'd basically then use something like PCI does, where I allocated a surrogate ID, and there's no ways of getting back to the ID number or whatever it was, and then I could actually I could obfuscate it by setting it to null if necessary, because it wasn't used in that database.
Yeah, so you were just saying we do have all those records in our warehouse, etc. And then I could potentially, I've got a further complication. As you know, in our environment, we really are the intermediary for 80% of the data.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we keep that data and, or the work with the data on behalf of our clients.
Yeah.
Funny thing, none of our insurers or clients have come back to me with any kind of destruction of data requests.
Right.
They seem to be putting the onus on me to come up with the policy, destroy the data, and then inform them. And that's how our policy is set out at the moment. I have to identify my targets for retention and for destruction and send it to our clients. They need to go through it and confirm or deny whether they agree with it. And only then can I do it, because other requirements, I have to send all that data on a daily basis to my clients as well and get measured on the data quality, customer records, personal information. And why are they not, should they not have some
Yes.
kind of retention policy in place and doing something? It
And
just baffles me that they seem to leave the onus on me.
No,
And that they're happy to take whatever data I send them, no matter how old it is, if it's still relevant.
Yeah, you see that, and that's where, like, as a service provider, you know, Poppy's very clear. All of this is the onus of the responsible party, not the service provider. Although I think in practice, when somebody outsources something to a service provider, they expect the service provider to do. So if I outsource my HR function, I kind of want them to tell me what the destruction policy should be and what the retention policy should be. Because they're the experts on HR, human, you know, the laws around labor laws or whatever. I don't want to have to go and research labor laws. I want them to tell me. However, that doesn't make it their responsibility. It's my responsibility. So they can present me with, and I should demand a retention policy and a retention schedule, and I should approve it as the responsible party. And then when the destruction or the data management happens, I should ask for records that the data has been managed in accordance with the policy, because I have the accountability, and it's my information governance. So for the governance requirement never goes away from the customer, right? So you're providing an information management service. And one way around that, I think, is where if they are going to do things that are going to create extra risk for you, so legally you won't be in trouble because it's not your data to decide whether to destroy or not, right? Like, as far as I can tell from reading Poppy, I can't see a reason. I mean, the security is your issue, but I can't see how this destruction thing is your problem. However, if you are forced into a position where you have to make these decisions, contractually they have got to sign off on it as part of the onboarding. And if they are lackadaisical about it and they don't do the approvals and they don't ask for the deletion request or whatever, personally, I think there should be penalties. Like, it's the same as like if a customer starts demanding that they include live data in the test data, right? So you're doing software development or testing, and the customer is insisting on just downloading their CRM and giving the whole thing to you. I think you can penalize them for that extra risk, because you're now having to cope with securing a whole bunch more data than you should have to. Same if they don't if you never get round to getting approval, because they should approve the deletion, right? Your job is to tell them, like Metrofile, if I have paper boxes with Metrofile, there's a file plan, and on the file plan it says this box must be destroyed on the 14th of April 2023. They will come to me and say to me, this box is due for deletion, for destruction. We need approval. They're not going to go ahead and destroy it. I have to approve it. But if I don't approve it, I have to pay for the storage. See, because it's not their problem that I haven't. That's my.
Yeah. And if they don't approve the deletion of the record, will they be responsible for the outcome or the fallout for that?
If you end up with a mess of terabytes of data now you have to cope with, they should pay for that.
Yeah, but it's more than just space is relative. I mean, space is cheap. Storage space. But there's a legal obligation. If I say this should now be deleted, destroyed, and they.
Oh dear, am I still on?
Sorry, I put my unmute self on mute.
Sorry. Yeah.
I'm punching my finger down and I punched it on the mouse. Sorry. And sorry, Sanita, I saw you at your hands up. I think you want to add something because your hand came up right when I was asking the question. But yeah, it is. If they deny me, if I say this record has served this purpose, it serves its retention period, it should be deleted. Can I go ahead? And they say no, I can't go ahead. Are they legally then going to take the flak if the customer comes and lays a complaint?
Yes, because the customer is who? It's their data subject. So as long as you're not the responsible party, and you've got to be sure about that, because that's one of the reasons you want your Poppy program to be solid, right? You want to be very sure that data, you're not the responsible party for that data, and your contract should be very clear that you are not the responsible party. And you actually don't have authority. There are authorization boundaries, right? Like, you don't have authority to destroy data. You shouldn't have authority to do that. Your authority should come from the customer.
Yeah.
Your customer. So if the responsible party authorizes the destruction, sure. But maybe what you could do is to sort of contractually say to them, look, if we tell you it's time to destroy the data and you just don't do it, like you just never authorize, because sometimes people are just terrified and they don't want to be the one making the decision. So they just say, no, I'm not going to make a decision. So
Yeah,
in that situation, maybe you could just put it into like deep archive. It's like
yeah.
it'll take 2 days to get hold of it if you need it, but it'll be there.
Yeah, we in our retention policy, we've actually drawn up a process specifically dealing with this. I'm not talking about the unrestricted policy documents, those stuff. Those are retention deleted.
Yeah.
That's not a problem. I'm talking about database records. And with
Yes.
CBR legislation, we have to send those records to the insurers. If we go down as a company, they should be able to continue servicing their customer. But there is starting to a point where there's now all data in there and personal information that's not relevant anymore.
And that's going to make it very difficult.
Yeah.
Like if
So
you
our
get
retention process, our retention process and policy says we will identify which records is due for destruction, but then it gets sent to the client to make the final decision on those targets that we've identified, and they've got 30 days to make that decision. And then we act upon that.
And that's fair. And I think if there's consequences, like you decide, okay, we're not going to delete it, we're just going to put it into deep archive, right? We're going to put it into deep, like freezer storage. And it's going to take 2 days or 3 days to get that data back if they need it. I think that's fair. It's like, it's old data, as you said, and it shouldn't be hanging around creating mess. And this is part of the problem. If we never delete data, if we never actually get rid of it, it is going to impact on our ability to process data lawfully. So when e-discovery happens, or you need to apply legal hold, or when the data subject requests information, if you have to sort through terabytes of data, it's going to take a long time. It's going to be expensive.
Yeah.
So there's consequences. Sorry, did somebody else have a hand up for a question?
Yes, Sunita had her hand up.
Thanks, Howard. I just wanted to reply to Niels, but I think, Caroline, you've covered most of it. So I am an internal service provider to the business. I'm the brand records manager. And yes, I often have this problem where people are afraid to delete data. It is my responsibility to tell them when that, according to the various legislation, when records are up for deletion, but it ultimately is their responsibility. And often I have the conversation to say, okay, so if you want me to decide, I will decide. So I'm telling you, according to legislation, we only need to keep these records, for example, for 7 years, and the rest can be deleted. And then suddenly the conversation sparks where they say, no, but we need this information for this reason and for that, and this complexity. And so we sit around the table, we draft a set of disposition rules, decide the criteria that we can use to identify the records that need to be disposed, goes through the whole approval process. And yes, even after that, I still get pushback in terms of signing off on that, on those rules. But
that extra step, let's just delete it. Like, no, it never happens.
yeah, but I think just about everything else is covered by Caroline. So is your responsibility to, in terms of legislation, tell your clients when their records are up for destruction. And if they don't want to delete, then they need to just provide you with a justification and then just keep that on record. Because as the vendor, you are not the responsible party.
Exactly. And that's harder when you're an internal department. I think you almost
internally, that's a different case altogether.
But as an external service provider, it can be pretty straightforward and you can put it in the contract. But even internally, that's where I think it's important to have things like organizational, operating level agreements. So like SLAs, but for internal use. And what's helpful about this section 14 of POPI is that if personal information is involved, then leverage these reasons. So we're not, our originals or our legal obligation is ended. It's the 5 years is up. But we have operational reasons why we must keep it. Then you can say, okay, well, look, can we de-identify it? Could we legitimately say you need it for decisions? Maybe people will come back with questions about the decisions. What are those operational reasons? And as long as it's written down and applied consistently, and there's an objective process, like a reasoning behind it, that you've taken reasonable steps. I don't think, like, it's going to be very difficult to get into trouble because of this. I think it's going to be more that your operational expenses, inefficiencies, the difficulty of legal hold, presenting evidence in court, all of those kinds of return on investment type impacts are going to, you know, those are real drivers. I don't think people are going to, I don't think any business owner is going to say delete data because of Poppy. I think it's going to be, well, you know, it's going to cost you lawyer fees by the hour to sift through 3 terabytes of data. I think that's going to be a motivation.
Fantastic.
Guys, yeah, sure. Stunting to silence.
Yeah, you just
Hopefully
surprised
you got
them.
some ideas.
Yeah, no, I think we're on the right track at least.
It sounds like you got a solid plan there.
Yeah, but you know, it's proof is in the pudding. We are going in the obfuscation. The obfuscation was first proposed or brought in by a global team in the UK for GDPR, and they chose obfuscation as the method. So that was sort of what the group has sort of brought in. That's why we're going that route. But I think there is value of trying to get my production databases or live, you know, regional source rate databases cleaner and less data in it. So
Yeah.
I'm definitely going to pursue that a little bit more aggressively in between everything else. Yeah.
This might just help a little bit just to cement it for you. I was my very last slide, which I didn't get time for. Defensible methods, right? Like, how are we going to do this? Well, just be defensible. Make sure that you can defend it in court. And one way that you can defend it in court is to use accepted best practice. Now, what's interesting is that the information regulator has produced a guideline for the purpose of a PIA for records management. Very good document, by the way. I highly recommend everybody reads it. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. And in that guideline, they have stated the National Archives and Records Service of South Africa has endorsed the ISO 15489. SANJ just means it's adopted by the SABS. So ISO 15489, ISO 23081, and ISO 1508701. So if you can go and leverage those ISO standards, and there's also this the primary benchmark for creating and managing electronic records in office environment. The principles and functional requirements for records in electronic office environments adopted by the International Council of Archives. And it's a module in there for guidelines and functional requirements for electronic records management systems. And they basically say that a product that complies with these standards would possess the records management functionality required by the National Archives and Records Services. And what I'm getting at there is pay attention to the guidelines that the information regulator is providing. The guideline on the management of electronic records, I think, is probably one of the best papers I've read on records management. It's a brilliant piece of work, and it cross-references things. It's nice and it's easy to digest. Just go read it yourself. Go read it. See if you can find defensible stances that you can leverage. Just say, okay, we're doing it this way, but how can we create that little bit of cement under our feet to help us to stand on this in a court of law? I mean, so that might be a helpful, just to kind of put that final tick mark against your feeling of confidence.
100%. Thank you.
And those ISO standards might not be entirely helpful or whatever, you know, you adapt and adopt. Or adopt and adapt. You know, but at least you can read them and reference them and say, look, you know, part of our policy has been founded on these ideas. And I think that will go a long way to helping you if it ever does become a problem. So that's actually my last one. So yeah, so that sort of covers off the topics there. And yeah, thanks guys. It was a good conversation. I think it's 5:30. I don't know if we still have any burning questions. I'm happy to stay. I've got no issue with that. But I'm sure an hour and a half is as much as anyone wants to listen to me.
Any final questions before we close? Okay, no? Fantastic. Caroline, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining in the discussion. It was great. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. It was a nice discussion.
Goodbye.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye. Goodbye.